what are the rules for RMDs, required minimum distributions, on inherited IRAs?
So RMD rules. Okay, so this comes up a lot.
Hmm.
Yeah, and rightfully so. Requirement of distributions. I mean, I'm going way back here, but back in the 90s, we used to do seminars, and it was the most talked about concept. Mainly because if you don't do it right, the penalty is 50% of what you're supposed to
Yep.
do. So if you're supposed to take out 10,000 and you don't, it's a $5,000 penalty. So people worry about that, rightfully so. I've never seen anybody pay the penalty,
Hmm.
even for some people that didn't do it right. But nonetheless, it's why it motivates people to look at it. And of course, they keep changing it. I can. There's dozens of changes that have happened since the 90s. So if you have a beneficiary inherited IRA, so this is one specific area of the required minimum
Yep.
distribution rules. And if you're a spouse, right,
Yep.
and you're the primary beneficiary, really easy. Yeah,
Yep.
you can leave it as an inherited IRA or just move it into your own IRA. Oftentimes we see people move it into their own IRA just to make it simpler and keep it in one account. And so that's pretty straightforward.
Mhm.
Uh, if you're not a spouse, that's where it gets more complicated.
Yeah. So there's basically three categories you fall under. You have your eligible designated beneficiaries, which is your spouse. If the inheritance is going to a minor, someone that's under the age of 18, or a child that's a minor, your child that's a minor, and then if the person is also within 10 years of your birthday, so basically a lot of times it's a sibling, is one of those people, or it's going to someone that is chronically ill or disabled. And those are kind of those where you're allowed to stretch it for a lifetime.
So minor, 10 years within your age, or disabled, right? Those three categories are unique within this particular law. They inherit an IRA. They can stretch that over. What they call a stretch IRA just means that you can use the tables that the IRS has, look up your age, and then there's a factor. You divide that into the value at the end of each year. It tells you what you need to take out. If you look closely at that table, it goes all the way out to, I think, 120 now,
Yeah.
right? And so you can basically slowly but surely take money out of that retirement account for the rest of your life. One exception, though, is the minor.
Yeah.
Because once the minor turns in 18, then they have
ten
they
years.
fall into the other rules. Okay, so that's one classification, right? And so what's the next classification?
Next one, you have the 10-year rule, and that's generally everyone. It's essentially anyone that is a individual. So I give it to a friend that's like 20 years younger than me. Okay, they withdraw it in 10 years.
Or a child, right?
Yeah.
Who's not under 18.
Yeah.
So this is basically anybody that is not right under 18, not within 10 years of your age, and not disabled, but they are an individual, not a trust, right?
Yeah.
They have to withdraw over a 10-year period.
Yeah, and then there's the 5-year rule, which is kind of trust and estates.
Right.
So that's where it kind of gets wonky, where it's not an individual.
Right.
And so that's why trusts are the weird one. They can fall in a gray area. So sometimes a trust could be a lifetime stretch, could be a 10-year, could be a 5-year. So you have to really work with your state attorney and tax advisor to make sure your trust is set up properly.
Yeah, exactly. We don't see as many trusts. Again, they can get kind of complicated, but there are certain situations where it definitely makes sense. The most common group is the one where we have this 10-year distribution, and so there's some complications in there also. So essentially, at the moment, there is no requirement to withdraw anything until the end of the 10th year. So this is one misconception too. So let's say you inherited this in August of one year. It's not by the next August 10 years later that you have to withdraw it. It's actually by the end of that 10th year, December 31st. But what I'm worried about is that somebody has a fairly large IRA and they don't really understand the rules and they're just leaving it and letting it sit there. They're not taking anything out. And then all of a sudden in that last year, they have to put $1 million or whatever it might be worth by the end of that 10th year on their tax return. And so much of that's going to be at such a high rate.
Yeah, and so the IRS kind of understood this in a sense. And so they had the rule. they had this proposed rule in February of 2022 where you would take out, you would have, if the person that was deceased had RMDs, you would also continue RMDs based on your life expectancy.
Right.
And so you would take 9 years of RMDs, and then the 10th year you would have to distribute the rest of the IRA.
Right. So you inherit this, let's say, from your parents. They're already taking the minimum distributions out, right? You have to keep taking minimum distributions out. Now it's based on your life expectancy,
Yeah.
so it's a smaller dollar amount at the end of that 10th year. But that's been
So
delayed, right?
So essentially, no one knew this, and so a lot of people are playing. Oh, well, just some people are playing because you can time it, control your income using that IRA. People are playing. Oh, I'm going to retire in 5 years. I'll start taking then, and so the IRS has waived 2020 and 2021 and 2022, and now in July they announced they're waiving 2023, and then 2024 they said they'll have their official announcement, but they could waive another year.
So far, there's no requirement
Yep.
to take out anything. There should be a requirement, and I don't know why they're messing around with this. Obviously there's a knowledge issue, but usually they don't allow that to be. Ignorance is not usually a good defense when it comes to taxes. So because here's my concern, and here's what we're doing within our practice, is I want to make sure that we're not getting a massive surprise for the beneficiaries of these IRAs. If it's really small, then it doesn't matter. If it's a $10,000 IRA or something, that's not important. But if it's 300,000, 500,000, 3 million, whatever it is, that could be a huge problem at the end of 10 years because it's all taxable income that has to come out. So what we've been doing is essentially, at least on a basic basis, recommending that the first year you get it, you divide by 10, take that much out. Then you divide by 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, all the way down to the last year, you're taking divide by 1, means you take the rest out. It kind of evenly distributes more or less the money over that 10-year period. And then what we want to do is just make adjustments sometimes to that program. So 1 year comes along, wow, I'm going to have a lot of income this year. Maybe you don't take it this year and you double it up the next year, or just the opposite. I've got really low income this year. I'm going to take more this year and less later. So you can make some adjustments within a tax planning strategy there. But I would recommend, starting to take an even amount out. There's other things happening too that people just aren't talking about. But 2025, the current tax rates sunset, and they're better than the previous tax rates.
Yep.
And so if Congress in 2025 somehow isn't aligned to a point where they can say, okay, we're going to continue these, we're going back to the old tax rate. So I would still be wanting to factor that in and maybe having a little bit more coming out of those beneficiary IRAs prior to 2025, just because there's a possibility that after that I might have higher tax bracket. So these are things, again, there's the stretch concept where there's 3 groups that can kind of stay in there, some spouse, somebody within 10 years of your age, somebody who's disabled or a minor up until age 18, they can use the tables and stretch that out. We've got this 10-year rule for individuals that don't fit in those, other categories. They have to take it out over a 10-year period. And then, of course, we have the trust thing, which is convoluted, but it could be 5 years.
Yeah.
And actually it could be 10, or it could be stretched all the way out. So it depends on the trust. But nonetheless, most of the people are kind of in that 10-year category and being able to do that. Now, again, if you inherited the IRA prior to the end of 2019, none of that matters. There was no 10-year rule.
It's a stretch. And these are all minimum requirements. So
Yes.
you can always take more if
Yes.
you need to.
Right.
But this is what the bare minimum you would have to do.
Yeah, and my fear right now, there is no requirement to take out anything. And so we got people that are going to be very surprised at the end of this 10-year period because they just don't realize what's happening. And so they end up with this big chunk of money that ends up on a tax return. So if you have kids, make sure that they kind of understand how the inheritance of your large IRA is going to play out, and maybe have them talk to us, for example.
Yeah, and I was looking at some of the major companies that handle like IRAs and stuff like so. And Vanguard explicitly says on their inherited IRA kind of informational that they don't provide any kind of distribution services or something.
Right.
So you have to do it yourself or talk to your tax advisor.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. They don't want the liability. We've been helping the clients doing that 10, 9, 8 calculations and calling them up or emailing and say, hey, we recommend you take out X amount this year to kind of even things out all the way across the 10-year period. So, yeah, just be careful there. So, good. So that's a great question. Thank you for asking that, and we'll hopefully cover that, I think, in pretty good depth.